What's going on, folks? Here at Tool Dyno Works, and today I am on the dyno with our brand new 2025 Ninja 1100. Now, obviously, I've got the right side cowling and fairing off here just so I can go ahead and get to an ignition coil for a tack signal on the dyno, but those of you that are familiar with the old Ninja 1000 will notice that it kind of looks the same. If I walk over to the other side of the bike here, it really looks the same. I mean, there is not a whole lot of difference going on here visually from the outgoing model. In fact, as far as I can tell, pretty much everything but the engine is the same. There's a few little tweaks here and there from the 1100 to the 1000, engine aside, but if I didn't know any better and I saw a couple of these fly down the road past me if I was in one of my cars, I would just think it was another Ninja 1000. But the important part from a tuning standpoint is that bad boy, if I can point over there, to that new engine, because it really is new. Absolutely everything in there, with the exception of the valves, is different from the 1000 to the 1100. And I really mean everything. Different crank, different cases, different rods, different pistons, obviously different piston rings to go with the pistons, different head, different cams, everything, literally besides the valve part numbers, is different. Now, it's also worth mentioning that Kawasaki was a little deceptive in the marketing department on the outgoing model because it was never actually a Ninja 1000. It was 1043 cc's, and now this new one is 1099. So it's not really an upgrade in terms of a full 100 cc's worth of displacement from the 1000 to the 1100. It's like 56. And the reason I bring up the displacement is because the advertised output, again, advertised from Kawasaki, goes backwards on the Ninja 1100, but I'll get to why that's bullshit here in just a second. The outgoing model, depending upon which year of the press release you were looking at from Kawasaki, was either rated at like 138 horsepower or 140. There's even confusion there, but that's beside the point. The new one, the 25 1100, is only rated at 134. And that's not what we see here on the dyno when we're actually measuring power to the wheel from the outgoing platform to the new one. If we take a look here, this is a baseline run on a stock Ninja 1000 from like 2021. And again, it's been the same bike since 2020 to 24. And it made like 124.9, so 125 horse and 75 foot-pounds of torque to the tire on pump gas. Again, bone stock, no tuning done whatsoever. And before a bunch of people in the comments freak out going, oh, but that's not what Kawasaki says it makes, you must be wrong. Remember that manufacturers advertise horsepower at the crank. They're not talking about it at the tire. Chassis dynos always measure output to the wheel where it actually matters. Measuring horsepower at the crank instead of the wheel, it's kind of like measuring your cock before your balls. You can't use it, so nobody fucking cares. Now here's the part we do care about. This brand new 25 Ninja 1100 is making pretty much the same horsepower, 124.84 horsepower to the tire on pump gas, with a little more torque, about 77.5 foot-pounds. Bone stock. Now, just looking at the numbers, you would think, holy crap, that's not really that cool. It makes the same horsepower, 2 foot-pounds of torque more, costs a little bit more now, out of an extra 56 cc's. Why wouldn't I just stick with the old one? Well, let's overlay the two graphs and you can actually see there's some pretty significant improvements, stock versus stock, right off the bat between this one and the outgoing model. So here's the overlay, and you can see the blue line there, which is the 1100, the new bike, is making like 5 foot-pounds of torque more and 4 horsepower right off the bottom, and then pretty much everywhere to like 8,500 RPMs. And I bring up 8,500 RPMs because I'm pretty sure that's where the stock tuning is starting to kick this thing in the nuts. Let's just focus on this 1100 here for a second. Whenever I start seeing waviness and weirdness here in the power curve and in the AFRs, right there where the bike's starting to build peak power, on any modern Euro 5 compliant machine, that 99 times out of 100 is throttle-by-wire intervention. So the throttle-by-wire system is pulling power, regardless of what your wrist is asking the bike to do with your throttle hand. And that's important to see, because that means, and again, what I've expected pretty much this entire time since the platform was announced, is that this is not actually going to be a less horsepower but more torque version of the Ninja 1000. With proper tuning, it will make more power everywhere. And while we're on the topic of tuning, we really need to talk about how this bike is tuned from the factory for the stock system. This sucks, and this is the same crap that we see from pretty much all of the modern Euro 5 Plus compliant bikes. Once they're at wide open throttle, they are down into like the 11.9 to 12 to 1 AFR range pretty much throughout the entire rev range. And right here where it finally starts to lean out is yet another reason I expect there's a lot of throttle-by-wire intervention here, because all of a sudden it goes back to something reasonable like the 13.2 to 1-ish range, which usually means the throttle-by-wire system is pulling the throttle away and back to a slightly leaner portion of the mapping as far as the targets are concerned. But I truly do not understand what most manufacturers are trying to accomplish by doing stuff like this. There is no reason whatsoever to run a naturally aspirated 11.8 to 1 motorcycle engine at 12 to 1 AFR. It makes absolutely no sense. You're actually making emissions worse, you're shortening the life of the catalytic converter, and you're decreasing fuel economy and costing power. So it just doesn't math out to me. And it's not just Kawasaki doing this. This is the same stuff that we see now on pretty much all the Euro 5 Plus compliant bikes. I've tuned tons of them, and they all are just overly rich at wide open throttle. Maybe they're trying to play it safe because they know people are going to get rid of this junk exhaust system, which we're going to get to here in just a second. But even that is still just a stupid way to send the bike out of the factory. And what's worse is that it's not just overly rich everywhere. Obviously, it has to be emissions compliant. So in the closed loop portion of the mapping at light throttle and cruise, it's stupidly lean, like 14.7 to 1 AFR, which would maybe be okay back in the day of like no ethanol pump gas, but that's not the world we live in. Even Stoic at E10 is like 14.4 to 1 AFR, so the bike just feels kind of anemic, and then once you finally get past like half throttle, all of a sudden you get into like the 13 to 1 range or the 12 to 1 range, and there's this big hitch where the bike starts to actually make power because there's some fuel in the freaking system. And it just doesn't feel good. You are rolling around a corner, you start to get on the gas, and all of a sudden there's just this big surge as it goes from stupidly lean to overly rich, and it's just not a great end user experience. Again, I know the manufacturers are really hamstrung by emissions compliance, but that just doesn't make any sense to me. You guys can do better than that. But at the same time, if the manufacturers did a better job, I wouldn't have one. So let's talk about the real problem with this platform, because it actually isn't tuning whatsoever. It's this stock exhaust system. The stock headers, if you're just looking at the headers, have a nice crossover pipe and are pretty much the exact same as the outgoing Ninja 1000 model. Cool, no big deal. This abomination is the problem. And it's the same crap that is present on pretty much all modern Kawasaki's. This is the same kind of stuff that we see on the 6th Gen ZX10, the newest ZX6, the ZX4s, all of them have this ridiculously necked down collector at the O2 sensor. And in one of Kawasaki's press releases, they say that this somehow increases the sampling accuracy of this narrowband O2 sensor, which I guess makes sense because you're physically reducing the size that the exhaust gas can travel through. So yes, it is more condensed, and therefore this will be a more accurate sampling mechanism. But then you also neck it down again post-cat before it gets to the bread box. And of course, there's no slip fittings here until you finally get to the end of this big cannon of a muffler. So you can't just replace the bread box or the cat or any portion of this without doing all of it, which means if you really want to actually get some real performance out of your 1100cc Ninja 1100, you're doing a full system. Because again, replacing the slip-on will get you a little bit more noise, and this is pretty heavily baffled, so you get a few more ponies out of it in terms of exhaust flow, and you can replace it because there's a slip fitting right there, but that's not going to do much. This is the big problem that Kawasaki continues to put on all of the modern bikes. And if you're curious just how much of a problem that really is, go ahead and take a look at the dyno graphs on our website that we have under our ECU flashing for something like the latest ZX6. You'll see that a slip-on versus a full system, because of that header design, which again is shared between all the new modern Kawasaki's, is like a 10 horsepower difference. On the ZX10s, it's like 8 or 9 horsepower right through the meat of the RPM range. And if the outgoing Ninja 1000 model tells us anything, it's that these new ones will have the same huge improvements from a proper exhaust system and tuning. Because on the old 1000s, I could get nearly 140 horsepower to the tire and 81 pound-feet of torque on pump gas all day long. And obviously I can't guarantee anything until we get our full system installed on this bike and get access to the ECU bin file definitions, which we've already sent over to Woolwich, but that's a totally different story. I do expect that we will be seeing mid 140 horsepower range or so out of this engine with a full system, and somewhere in the mid 80s for torque, which is awesome torque. This is exactly what the bike is meant for. It's not a ZX10. It is not a crotch rocket or a super sport bike or even a super sport bike. It's a sport touring bike. It's big, it's upright, it's comfortable, makes a boatload of torque, But if you talk about mid 140 horsepower range, you can still have a boatload of fun. Even the MT-10, which is Yamaha's sort of hyper naked king, only makes like 150 range. So having a more upright and even more comfortable bike that gives better fuel economy than the MT-10 does is a pretty awesome setup from Kawasaki with the new 1100. So if you're picking up one of the new Ninja 1100s, you've got one of the outgoing Ninja 1000 models, or you're just curious to see what the hell we do with this thing, follow along. We'll be posting all of our updates here as we go through our testing and tuning process on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And our ECU flashing will already be available for this bike very, very shortly. And always, if you have any questions whatsoever about getting your bike properly tuned and dialed in, do not hesitate to reach out at support@tooldynoworks.com. I answer tech support emails personally every single day, and we are always happy to help get your bike properly tuned and dialed in here at Tool Dyno Works.